Okay, well, I'd love to welcome you to today's webinar. I think we'll just wait 1 or 2 minutes just to allow some more people to join before I make the introductions. So I'll just take a moment here. Okay, it's 1 minute past, so I think we can look to get started. As I said, I'd love to welcome you to today's webinar. It's that time of year, improving gifts, entertainment, and conflicts of interest management. I'm Verity Blair. I'm the VP of Sales at Lextegrity, and I'm really honoured to be joined today by 2 compliance thought leaders. Victoria Lane, Head of Ethics and Compliance at Pilgrims, and Jess Budoff, Senior Vice President, Global Deputy Chief Compliance Officer at NBC Universal. So thank you both so much for joining the webinar today. I'd love it if each of you could introduce yourselves. Maybe we can start with Vicky and then over to Jess to introduce yourselves.
Sure, thank you, Verity. So my name is Vicki Lane. As Verity said, I'm the Head of Ethics and Compliance for Pilgrims Pride Corporation. We're a publicly traded company, and we are poultry producers. So if you are chicken-eared, you've most likely enjoyed some of our products at some point in time. So I've been with Pilgrims for 2 years now. Throughout my career, I've also spent time in various government positions. Most recently, I served as the Chief Special Counsel for Ethics and Compliance for the state of New York. And previous to that, I spent 20 years in private practice, where my focus was on white-collar criminal and civil defense, government investigations, and advising clients on compliance matters. I decided to take a bit of a career shift, decided to take my knowledge of interacting with DOJ, SEC, and regulators, and advising clients, and really turn my entire focus to compliance. So I'm very passionate about compliance, and I'm really happy to be part of this webinar.
Thanks so much, Vicky. Jess?
Sure, thanks, Verity. So I'm Jessica Budoff. I work at NBC Universal. We're a global media and entertainment company. I've been in-house for about 10 years doing compliance work, initially focused on the FCPA. I continue to help cover that area along with sanctions and trade controls and money laundering and a whole host of other areas. So excited to be part of this discussion.
Thanks so much. And just a little bit more about me. I've been in the compliance technology space for some time. I've worked with many organizations at various stages of program maturity to help them advance their approaches and mitigate risk using technology. I'm particularly interested in, and I'll be talking a little bit about today, the opportunity that data analytics presents to companies in advancing their compliance programs. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Lextegrity, we're a technology company. We're founded and led by former in-house compliance and internal audit leaders who wanted to build more powerful applications combining workflow automation to aid prevention and leveraging data for sophisticated detection of risks. Before we get into discussions, in terms of housekeeping, I wanted to say that the views and opinions of all speakers today are their own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the entities that they represent. And in full transparency, NBC Universal and Pilgrims are customers of Lextegrity, albeit some of the use cases we'll be talking about today are still in the implementation stage. So we've got a great discussion planned for you today. We'll be delving into the challenges and opportunities of effective gifts and hospitality and conflicts of interest management. I know the 3 of us have a lot to say on that topic, but please do ask any and all of your questions throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on those. So with that said, let's kick off and perhaps start with a high-level question for you, Vicky. Prior to joining Pilgrims, as you mentioned in your introduction, most of your career had been spent at law firms, presumably advising clients on what it is to have an effective program. So I'd love to kick it off with you and maybe ask, what is an effective compliance program, particularly as it relates to gifts, travel, and conflicts of interest?
Okay, so thanks, Verity. So, when I look at, an overall compliance program, the criteria is always the same, right? Whether you can prevent, detect, and remediate misconduct. And it's the same with any component of a compliance program, of course, which gifts, meals, entertainment, and conflict of interest is part of it. So I always look to the DOJ criteria in terms of what's an effective compliance program, asking, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Is it being applied earnestly in good faith, meaning is it adequately resourced and empowered in its function? And does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? So with many things in the compliance world, it is really industry, company, geography specific. So, step one is always to do a risk assessment and try to figure out what it is you're trying to solve for, right? Like, what are your risks and what are you trying to mitigate? So in terms of, gifts, meals, and entertainment, again, it really varies by company, by industry, by geographic location, and also whether the employees are giving or receiving the gift, meal, or entertainment. The risks can include, violation of your own conflict of interest policies, right? Unduly influencing business decisions if your employees are receiving gifts, meals, entertainment by a customer or client. Commercial bribery, of course, in areas like UK where they have commercial bribery statutes, bribery of government officials, FCPA, as Jessica mentioned, violations of procurement and anti-kickback laws, particularly in the healthcare space, and also violation of our third parties' gifts, meals, and entertainment policies, right? So generally, in my experience, contracts we have with customers or clients include an agreement to comply with their policies. So by virtue of giving or receiving gifts, we may also be inadvertently violating our third parties' policies. So, again, like with any compliance program, the key is really whether your gifts, meals, and entertainment compliance program prevents, detects, and allows your company to remediate misconduct. And I'm looking forward to getting into the data part of it later, because that is the detection is really key.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vicky. And so, perhaps just to kind of build out on that a little bit further, I think, we can all relate to and have seen probably at various organizations we've worked for and with the first generation approach, policies that are helping to manage employees' understanding of procedures, that they are required to carry out in order to be compliant. They're certainly not new. But I think some of the preventative approaches, and certainly on the detective side, as we've alluded to, those are newer approaches that we're seeing companies implement to advance appropriate controls in place to document, address potential risks. You've just mentioned a number of them, Vicky, and also monitor, these risks of corruption, undisclosed conflicts of interest, fraud, embezzlement, sanctions violations. So question for you, Jess. I know since you joined NBC Universal, you've been really leading the charge with some of the changes to your policies and approaches to managing gifts and hospitality and conflicts of interest. Can you talk about what makes a good policy and how you've thought about controls at NBC Universal?
Sure. So I think as Vicky explained, one of the key pillars of a compliance program is always going to be a set of policies and procedures that outline clear expectations for employees. So I think the hallmarks for us of a good policy are, one, just clarity on what those expectations are, really understand the law and the risk that you're trying to solve for and your business use case so that you can really make it resonate with what the business is doing. Shorter is better. I have come to embrace that more and more over time. I think there's a tendency to want to write a lot and explain a lot about the law, and it's really not sort of necessary to be effective when you're doing an employee-facing policy. I think sometimes less is more, as long as you can kind of articulate why it's important and what the sort of risk imperative is. And then another thing is just really understanding your audience. Sometimes I think there's a tendency to sort of have policies be really broad and really sweeping, and sometimes overly so. And to make them work, you really have to be thoughtful about, who is actually engaging in the activity that is relevant to this particular standard, so that I can, tailor it to them and not have sort of over breadth that is not really workable for the business. So I think those are some of the principles that have guided us when we're sort of enhancing our policies and procedures. In terms of the control environment, I think there's two pieces to it. One is a suite of controls that help employees comply with the policy. So that's pillars like training and awareness and systems and procedures that really give step-by-step instructions on how the employees can meet the expectations that you set out. And the other piece is really sort of internal to the compliance team on how do you monitor and track that compliance. So whatever you've said you're doing from a standards and process perspective, what are your mechanisms to make sure that's actually happening? And I think that's where we get into using systems and data and meaningful metrics and really building sort of monitoring and testing scenarios that actually capture whether that compliance is happening.
Fantastic. Vicky, you too, I know, have been very involved in some of the, focus in recent policy updates in this area for Pilgrims and JBS, which also include training and awareness, some of the themes that Jess touched on there, and also partnering with the business to really empower them to own more of this process around gifts and hospitality and conflicts of interest. So can you talk to how you've thought about that?
Sure. So, again, it varies by industry, but in, a lot of industries, it's a very legitimate business practice, right, to, provide gifts, meals, and entertainments and receive them. So to me, the goal is to kind of really balance the compliance needs with the business needs. I agree completely what Jessica said. I think policy shorter is better. But the easy part, right, is writing a policy, right? The hard part is getting people to actually follow the policy. And I think it's so key to engage the business people, engage, the employees to understand, okay, what's a process that would work most easily for you, right? So maybe it's something where they can an app on their phone, right, when they're out to dinner or something, they can, immediately disclose, something like that. Like what's going to make it easier for them to comply. And of course, we also provide the training, et cetera. But I think a lot of it's really understanding the business and working closely with business because you want buy-in from everyone, right? You just want to make it, to me, having a policy that's not followed is worse than not having a policy at all. So I think the challenge is always to really find a way to make it easy as possible for people to comply.
It certainly makes a lot of sense. And Vicky, perhaps a follow-up question for you here too. You were part of a new team who came in and the changes that you described included implementing a very strict new policy. I know we talked about that. What have you learned from that, and how have you continued to partner with the business to adapt your policy and approach?
Sure. So, right. So we were a fairly new team when I joined 2 years ago, and we started with very low thresholds, meaning that ethics and compliance had to approve of a lot of different, a large volume of gifts, meals, entertainment, et cetera. It was helpful as a first step to us because we really got to learn exactly what what is out there and what the patterns are. But we did ultimately, change our thresholds, pushing more down to the business to be responsible for those lower thresholds and really freeing up our time to focus on what turns out to be bigger risks than those things. We started out as a very manual process for us. We have an interim phase right now where we have it's more automated, but we are moving the first of the year to like a completely automated system through Lextegrity that is just going to really, I think, empower us to also, detect if there's any non-compliance with the policy and really give us just greater visibility across the whole process.
Fantastic. Yeah, I know that's something, there's certainly a consistent theme in discussions we're having with compliance leaders, and we've touched on so many different risks that you guys are having to think about on behalf of the company. And it was one of the kind of firm principles of our founders that compliance teams today are often stuck doing much more administrative work than really they could do and should be doing, and so how can you kind of leverage technology to take care of that, empower the business to own more of that process, and free up compliance teams for higher risk, higher value matters. Jess, perhaps we can talk to conflicts of interest for a moment. I know that you have undertaken a big launch in that area in recent months. Where have you focused on ensuring success for this realignment?
Sure. So excuse me, for us, just topically, conflicts of interest focuses on principally employee outside activities like employment and other things that might interfere with their responsibilities to act in the company's interest. So our anti-bribery framework and other sort of policies focus more squarely on gifts and entertainment, although they sometimes intersect, but they're sort of parallel topical pillars for us. So from a conflicts perspective, the sort of heart of the policy is really around disclosure. If an employee has an activity that might give rise to a conflict of interest, and we sort of describe a whole host of potential activities, the control around it is to disclose it and to go through an approval process. And oftentimes with disclosure and with sort of a set of mitigating conditions, the activity may be acceptable, but the process allows us to sort of evaluate those individual circumstances and make a decision. So there's really two parts to the mechanism. One is an annual disclosure where employees are required to go through a questionnaire, even if the answer is that they have no potential conflicts. There's sort of an annual process that forces people to just think about it again and sort of tick through the circumstances and say, yes or no, whether they have anything relevant. And then the other opportunity is just, an ad hoc disclosure or update, as things come up outside of that annual process. So earlier in the year, we moved our whole sort of annual questionnaire process into Lextegrity. And it was very successful. I think it was the first time that employees and reviewers were really able to be in sort of a seamless workflow tool. So the feedback was positive, that it was very easy for employees to use. And I think the reviewer audience in particular really felt the benefits of the information was presented in an accessible way. They were able to navigate their review queue, see sort of where things were stuck, in ways that they couldn't previously. And then, from a compliance perspective, it allowed us to manage the data in a new way. So for example, an important part of our control is really around implementing and tracking those conditions. So if we get comfortable with an activity, often it's with certain guardrails, and we want that to sort of live with the record of the approval. We want employees to acknowledge those conditions. So I think the tool really allowed us to capture all of that in a helpful way. And then, just generate some metrics that helped both with risk identification, what types of activities do we have in what businesses, in what volume, but also just refine our process. So, again, where are things getting stuck, or are things sort of aging and taking a long time, and what can that tell us about just making the process friendlier and better? So, it was a very successful launch. And I think sort of anecdotally, we found that there were activities that were raised that perhaps came up earlier and just didn't make it into the sort of older, clunkier manual process, and different theories for that. But I think one was just it was just accessible and easy to use, and so it sort of resonated with employees what it was trying to elicit, from a risk perspective. So I think it was definitely a productive launch for us.
Fantastic. And Vicky, I know that that's an area that you're going to be turning your attention to shortly as well, the conflicts of interest. Is there anything you wanted to just add on that theme in terms of, how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. It just gives you such greater visibility, like you were saying, like when you have a system like that, to really kind of understand what your risks are in terms of conflict of interest or anything else. It's the entire industry is going more towards data analytics, right? Or not industry, but ethics compliance. We attended a conference last week where this was the subject of it, and I just think that trying to have more data in front of you and understand it and be able to glean insights from it is really going to help all of us. It's what we're expected to do.
Fantastic. And Jess, I wanted to ask you as well whether you had any further thoughts about simplifying gifts and hospitality workflows.
Yeah, I mean, we focused a lot on just, simplicity and usability, as I think Vicky touched on, also just, whatever your process is, making it easy for your employees to engage with, not a big sort of groan, I have to do whatever the compliance requirement is. So I think one thing that's helped us is sort of taking the burden off of employees to recognize a host of different, rules and nuances by just sort of coding the technology in that way. So for example, if you have, a bunch of different gift laws and rules, depending on your jurisdiction or depending on, your counterparty's limitations, that's a lot to remember. It's a lot to sort of set out in a policy and have people kind of know that they have to, consult that. But we've been able to sort of put it into the tool in such a way that all the employee needs to know is just go in and enter your request. And if you put in one of those jurisdictions, it's going to do the work for you. It's going to get that request to the right reviewer based on whatever that limitation is. So it sort of frees the employee up to not have to track, all of those things and just sort of know, like, put your request in, it's going to get navigated to the right place. So I think that's been useful both from a compliance perspective to know that we're capturing that stuff. You're not reliant on individual sort of recognition, but also just from an employee, just ease of use perspective.
That's great to hear. It's definitely, when we sort of thought about it from a user experience perspective, our goal was, how do you get the business user in and out as quickly and as easily as possible and get them their answer as fast as possible? Because we all know this is not what they want to be spending their time doing. It's a burden on top of the two jobs. So it's good to sort of hear that feedback, the other side of you using the tool. Perhaps I can weave some thoughts here too, based on how we've thought about this, which was focused on solving for the challenges that, as I mentioned, our founders who were formerly in-house, understanding a lot of these issues firsthand, and really wanting to build a better mousetrap. So, often I think a lot of organizations have siloed approaches, tools, data around gifts and hospitality, sponsorships and donations, conflicts of interest. Another challenge with the first generation approach that we see at a lot of companies is that those systems are not integrated into your downstream systems. So, being able to validate if something happened in line with what was approved or disclosed, is tricky. It becomes a manual reconciliation exercise. And really the lack of unified and holistic data means that auditing and monitoring is very manual and it's sample based. And it's why Lextegrity really focused on building a next generation approach. We wanted to bring together those system silos, automate any approvals and disclosure processes around gifts and hospitality, sponsorships and donations, conflicts of interest, managing third-party risk, all in one tool. So it's also in line with what we were saying, it's one tool for the business to learn, whether they're wanting to engage a third party and follow your process there, or they're doing their annual conflicts disclosure. I think a really important element though, which fits in with the regulatory expectations, I know we've touched on this a couple of times, is also around the means of being able to detect risk. And that really relies on being able to pull data from your ERP systems, T&E systems, HR data, and really to follow the money, so to automate the continuous monitoring of spend, to surface issues immediately before they become systemic. So I'd love to talk for a moment about some of the more advanced approaches that you have been undertaking that support your desire to take a risk-based approach. And Vicky, maybe you can start us off there.
Sure. So, the detection piece is what, I focus on quite a bit. You have different tools that we use, right? We have ethics line, we're encouraging people to speak up. We can do like audits, as you said, samples, things like that. But, to really be able to detect in real time, which is what, DOJ and regulators expect, I think you need a tool that you can really continuously monitor. So, one of the things that we were looking for was a tool that, as Verity mentioned, is not siloed. Really, like all of our systems were very much siloed, and it was a very manual process to kind of try to cross-reference things. So I really like that our system we use with Lextegrity has the three pillars, the three components. We have the gifts, meals, and our disclosure suite, gifts, meals, entertainment, conflict of interest, our third-party management system, our vendor management system, and then transaction monitoring. So I feel like when you add all those pieces together, we have far greater visibility. So just one example is, we have a proportionality standard that we use. And how do you really, that's really hard, right? Proportionality in terms of, you know, the amount of the gift to the business, and you want to see your aggregate values, et cetera. It's very difficult to do in a manual process. So I feel like, you know, you can see, you just have greater visibility, both in terms of detection and just maybe just seeing trends and maybe things that you need to look into and maybe modify some of your policies or controls. So that to me is, you know, really, really key for detection. It's very hard to do it without a tool that kind of connects all these pieces from my point of view.
Next to docs, absolutely, and also that real-time view, which I think is so important, rather than that kind of historical view that I think, because so many companies have been forced to do that manually historically, you know, you're often seeing the data quite a way down the line.
Right.
Jess, I'd love to hear from you on this topic too. Do you have anything further to add in terms of some of the more advanced approaches that you're thinking about and adopting at NBC Universal?
Yeah, I think we're certainly working towards that, you know, sort of bringing the data out of silos that allow you to sort of reconcile, like, you know, for example, if your expense reimbursement system, you know, identifies a recipient as a government recipient, you obviously want that to sort of speak to your pre-approval system and, you know, be able to, as you said, sort of real time connect those up. You know, did you get the approval? Did the spend exceed the approval? Did everyone sort of recognize that it was a government recipient? You know, all those things sort of want to be integrated. So I think that's part of what we're sort of working towards. You know, the other thing that I think the system sort of helps us do, short of even bringing the data, sort of integrating the data, is just identifying sort of similar scenarios and just, you know, ensuring kind of consistency of analysis and outcomes. I think one of the things that we found in a large organization is you have people engaging in similar types of activity, and you have sort of the one hand doesn't know what the other's doing problem sometimes, where you really should be trying to at least sort of apply similar analysis, whether you get to a different outcome. You know, you might if the facts are different, but you don't want to be sort of taking totally divergent, you know, positions on similar things. So I think bringing the data together, even just on the pre-approval side without the transaction, you know, the benefit of the transaction monitoring, you know, allows you to really, you know, identify similarity in circumstance and fact pattern in a really useful way. So that's something that I think even within just the pre-approval suite, you know, is kind of a quick win.
Powerful. Yeah, absolutely. There's a question that has come through from the audience, which I'd like to pose to you both, and also just use this as a reminder that if you do have any questions as we're talking today, we'd love to answer them for you. So the question is, do you require disclosure before or after the fact? And what do you do when there is, sorry, there's another question that's come in. And what do you do when there's a violation after the fact? So perhaps, Jess, you could kick us off there, and Vicky, I'd love your input too.
Sure. So I think the requirement is to get pre-approval. I think we really try to identify some circumstances that don't require case-by-case approval. We sort of look at the reality of what our businesses do on a regular basis, and if we can, we feel like it's, you know, low enough risk and sort of appropriate to not require, you know, approval each time, we might sort of say in advance, like, these types of things are okay. We've already sort of looked at the risk of those. You don't have to come to us every time. But if it doesn't fall into that bucket and it's sort of a one-off situation where the policy says, you know, get pre-approval, we do mean pre-approval. But I think we do say to people, you know, their mistakes are made sometimes, or circumstances are such where, you know, that doesn't happen. And we don't want to chill people from raising them afterwards. There's sometimes an opportunity to take some appropriate, you know, remedial action afterwards. So we want to be able to do that. So we say to people, if that happens, you know, you're then responsible to kind of tell us as soon as you can. And then again, we're sort of running ways of detecting that spend in parallel, you know, whether that's our reimbursement systems or other ways that we might find it if someone doesn't raise it. And then, you know, depending on the circumstances, I think each one kind of gets a case-by-case review on, you know, why did that happen? You know, what was sort of the employee's conduct? You know, we would sort of think about discipline, and I think in a really fact-specific, thoughtful way. But a lot of times we find that, you know, it is a matter of education, you know, that people sort of just failed to appreciate that either, you know, they had a government party, for example, you know, that might have been the miss, or that it was the kind of spend that wasn't, you know, sort of authorized in advance. So sometimes it really is a matter of taking that opportunity to sort of educate and not throw the book at them, but that's sort of a case by case.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the other piece that, you know, is important too in terms of having the picture even after the fact is being able to look at it from an aggregated perspective over the course of a period of time. Because, you know, if people were at that dinner or event and, you know, actually now that kind of pushes them over any annual thresholds that you have maybe set, or would be relevant the next time that that person is being entertained, then it's important to have that information after the fact, I think.
It's a good point. And look at patterns. You know, if you have some sort of frequent flyers, you
Yeah.
start to
It's we all do, right?
and look at that a little differently from the sort of one-off.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vicky, have you got any views on that?
Yeah. I would say, you know, obviously we would love to always know beforehand and be able to, you know, evaluate it beforehand, but just the reality of business, the pace of things, right? You could be at a conference, we've probably all been, you're unexpectedly invited out for dinner, you know, so the reality is you cannot always really encourage people to do it beforehand, but I do think it's fair to then put a time frame on it. So you have to, whatever makes sense for your company, but 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it is after the meal or whatever it is to disclose to us. You know, in terms of, I agree with what Jessica said. I mean, I think you begin with perhaps someone didn't understand the policy or didn't understand, you know, it's a government official, so those sort of things. So I think like with any kind of like disciplinary, you kind of start with like corrective. Okay, let's train, let's retrain, make sure that you understand the policy. And then I do think it's really important for any portion of your compliance program to really have kind of like clearly think out what your discipline structure is going to be, right? You know, if it happens once, if it happens twice, like kind of escalate, you know, the disciplinary measures. But I do think that, you know, a one-off event, it's really probably training that the person needs.
Yeah, and I think this leads us in nicely to what I wanted to sort of touch on next as well. You know, we've really mainly been talking about prevention processes, you know, which are important, you know, approvals, diligence, but they do rely on good faith. And I think that we can all agree that most people want to do the right thing, even if they're not always exactly complying with the policy, you know, as we've just been sort of touching on here. You know, they're likely not posing significant risk to the organization. So really the challenge is about, you know, how do you find the needle in the haystack? And those bad actors are the ones who are likely to know how to circumvent these processes or answer questions in a way that presents something as lower risk. So I think in our minds, you know, while these processes are necessary, they are insufficient alone in being able to demonstrate, you know, an effective program. And that's really where the detection piece comes in, you know, systems that will allow you to see the outliers on the other side of your approvals. But more than a hotline, because of course we know, again, that relies on good faith people, you know, kind of making those calls, so they're reactive. Many do testing here, you know, taking a sample-based approach to look for policy violations. Often that's done through audit or finance, but without testing 100% of spend data, you know, fraud, bribery, corruption schemes can easily go undetected and really proliferate. And this is data that historically compliance has not really had direct access to. They're not the owners of this data, which can make that tricky. So with that in mind, I wanted to, you know, take a portion of the webinar, you know, really to talk about the requirement to use data analytics as part of your program. And perhaps I can provide some more context here by talking through how data analytics as a means of detection can can expose expense reimbursement schemes. And I thought I'd use the recent Herbalife FCPA settlement, you know, to really kind of highlight this. So looking at that settlement, employees at Herbalife were submitting fake expenses and supporting documentation that were not flagged by internal audit for a year or more after the expenses were submitted. So just to take an example, one employee in just 6 months had received almost $800,000 in meal reimbursements. averaging $3,000 a meal and 18 attendees per meal. So yeah, obviously quite anomalous. Either that or he or she is having a great time and over a 6-month period. So, you know, if we call out some of the ways in which, you know, data analytics would have been able to surface this for review to compliance, you know, there, you know, are analyses that could have used anomaly detection on monetary value, for example, you know, which is flagging anomalous expense amounts relative to similar expense types. So meals of $3,000 or above are likely to have been flagged, you know, here. You know, another means of kind of scrutinizing this transaction might have been looking at a per attendee cost that flags expenses with a high per attendee amount. Again, relative to other transactions in a prior 12-month period. A third example would have been attendee count. So, you know, this is something that might flag that employees are gaming the per attendee cost, you know, by inflating the number of attendees. I'm not sure, I've done a lot of business lunches in my time. I think I can count on one hand how many times there've been more than 18 people, let alone at every meal in a 6-month period. And, you know, further, you can also use analyses to flag specific employees over a period of time who are exceeding thresholds. So, you know, Jess, I know you talked about having all of your country level thresholds. Vicky, I know you talked about the same thing, you know, for different types of gifts, hospitality, you know, travel, so on and so forth. So with all of that set, it's possible to also flag employees who are exceeding that. But ingesting that data from Concur, you know, from SAP, Oracle, in order to do so. And then, you know, I think another point to touch on here, because I know this is a new area for a lot of companies, you know, who are really kind of trying to get their hands around how to use data analytics. You know, a big focus that we have when helping companies with this challenge is really the value that aggregation can bring, because it allows you to monitor large volumes of spend data, you know, to really target precious compliance and audit resources to the highest risk expenses. So, you know, it's not necessarily going to surface something purely on the basis that your policy limit is $100 and somebody spent $110. It's not something that your team would be interested in reviewing. But if, you know, 3 or 4 of these flags are present in a transaction, it's you know, much more likely to be interesting because it's more likely to be anomalous. So, you know, continuous monitoring of spend data, you know, really can help to manage enterprise risk more effectively, and it's clearly what the government expects of companies today. I'll touch on too just another employee scheme in the same settlement, which saw other employees submitting meal receipts with very close transaction times from the same restaurant. So a couple of other examples of things that you would have been able to flag in this particular scheme, you know, looking at duplicate spend detection, which can flag transactions that would be from the same restaurant or vendor, you know, the same employee, the same value within a certain period of time, you know, so it's sort of taking multiple data points in order to look at that. And a lot of Herbalife employees had submitted expenses without pre-approvals that were required by policy, you know, for those particular expense types. So it's kind of where that first question was going, you know, around what to do there. And it does require relevant integrations, but it is also possible to flag transactions that do not have the associated pre-approval information. Or that were pre-approved but for a different amount or a different payee. So Vicky, can you talk about how you expect to see the role of spend monitoring play out at Pilgrims? I know we've touched on it a little bit already, but it'd be great to go a bit deeper there.
Sure, and just, you know, when you're talking about the Herbalife settlement, just thinking about, like, to the earlier point we were talking about is, so you know, I don't know all the specific facts of that, but another, you know, control, you want to layer your controls on top of each other, right? So the business, the supervisor, right, of that person is in a much better position to kind of understand the business rationale, or like, does this make sense? Why would there be 18 people there? I was at that conference, those sort of things. So I think it's really important. That's why it's so important to involve the business people, that there's a partnership there, that there's different levels of approval, and really no situation should just one person approve anything. But and that's the other issue too that you were talking about is, you want to understand when people are not seeking pre-approval. And the other piece, which is really hard to manage, is, okay, they sought pre-approval for, I don't know, $500 meal, and then it turns out, it was way more expensive, it's $800, but you never have visibility into that on a real-time basis. So it's just one of the many, just different things that we were looking to solve for in a technology solution. So, as Verity was saying, data aggregation, the spend aggregation was really important for us to see as well. I mean, we're receiving requests for approval in real time, and we just don't have the visibility to say, okay, wait, this is, this amount has now, gone way beyond what we expected, and that sort of thing. So we were looking for an off-the-shelf solution. I know some companies have kind of built their own solutions for this internally. We made a decision to not do that. So we wanted an all off-the-shelf approach that was easily, we could tweak it as risks emerge, and use a lot of different criteria. As you said, I mean, we don't want to spend time on $110, over time on those sort of reimbursements. But it really does, the solution that we're using, we're able to kind of solve for a lot of different risks, elevate certain transactions to compliance that we want to take a look at. Gives us a whole lens on all kinds of transactions and distributor revenue. Again, just really allowing us to detect, issues and patterns in real time. So that's really been kind of our solution, that's where we've landed. And again, it gives us just greater visibility to see patterns by having all these different systems connected.
Right. And I was just thinking there too, Vicky, as you were talking to that, I think some companies that we talk to, have discussed the, interest in being able to sort of automatically reconcile data from, the pre-approval into Concur. The challenge that we see with that, and I just wanted to talk about this for a moment, is that often these expenses that are being pre-approved because they're above a certain amount and the policy requires them to do so, those might be expenses that are then split between multiple employees' credit cards, for example, or some of it is going to go through the ERP because it's been invoiced, and so exactly ticking and tying the pre-approval with the exact expense in Concur is not as straightforward as you might think. But for us, when we were thinking about this risk in general and how we help companies solve for it, by kind of, rather than just looking at, oh, this was what was pre-approved and this is what was spent, that's interesting, but really we think, where is the value for compliance? And it's getting access to the data that historically compliance haven't had access to, and it's really giving that smoke detector, into the downstream systems. I spoke to somebody once who called it a fish finder, which I quite like too, but rather than looking at everything, and rather than concentrating on the 99% who are probably doing the right thing and probably are not of concern to you, how do you kind of automate all of that to see the things that would be concerning to you? Jess, as always with being able to advance approaches to managing risk, getting buy-in from the business and being able to really articulate the use case is important. Do you have any thoughts or advice for peers looking to make changes and justify advances and approaches to managing these risk areas we're talking to today?
Yeah, a couple of things that we found have worked really well. I think, the starting place is always like engaging the business to make sure we understand them, and what they're doing, really letting them sort of articulate what their needs are, what their examples are. and then trying to kind of craft a solution, that is, responsive to what they're saying, they actually do and need. I think it starts a little bit with the policies, where we started, like just sort of thoughtful policies that can articulate the why, just being able to have a crisp statement on, we're introducing a process or we're changing something that we're doing where, maybe we're adding some steps, but it is important. And here's like really succinctly what we're aiming for, why it applies to you guys. And then I think we really tried to bring some users in throughout the process, like from sort of revising the policies and procedures themselves, like really getting that substance right, to developing the requirements for the system, testing the system to make sure, both from a usability perspective and just a, sort of, accuracy, success perspective, it's performing as everyone anticipates. And I think that has been really appreciated, sort of saying to people, you guys are users, you're partners, we want you to be in it, we want it to work for you, we want to get feedback all along the way. Nobody is sort of handing it to you, done without your input. So I think that partnership, has been really appreciated. And then I think sometimes just going back to why it makes the process sort of faster and easier and less painful for everybody. Like once you can sort of explain, like this is the goal, here's the rule, we're all on the same page, that we're trying to comply with the rule, and we really want to do it in the fastest way, the most cost-effective way, the way that makes best use of your time, having to be out doing what you want to do, our time, again, sort of focusing on the risk, meaningful stuff that we should be doing, and not, sort of the noise and admin and burdensome stuff. I think that message has resonated pretty easily. So I think as long as you sort of approach it with, there's a natural reluctance to change. It's hard to tell people you're sort of, introducing a system they've never seen before, or, a change in process when, people sometimes feel like, what they've been doing maybe substantively was okay, but there's a reason you're sort of on a journey to make it better. So just kind of bringing people into that conversation along the way and sort of hearing them out. And I think the sort of usability of the tool has really been critical for us. Like when we sort of present, this is what the workflow looks like, really demystify it for people. This is the kind of information that it's asking you to put in. This is what it looks like. This is where it goes. People who submit requests can see themselves where it goes. It sort of takes that black box element out of it. When someone reaches out to an approver and sometimes doesn't know, like, I haven't heard back from them. Did they forget about me, or did it get stuck? They can actually kind of go in and see, like, oh, I see it. This is who has it. I can reach out to them. So all those things I think have just helped, bring people along, as sort of partners in the change.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And I have to say, I obviously work with a lot of companies, but I think it's really encouraging when a company brings the business to the table in some of those earlier stage, conversations, even in the kind of the pre-sales stuff, but also, certainly in the implementation phase too, as you say, to kind of be evaluating what's being implemented from a business perspective. We've got some questions that I'd love to put, if that's okay. So we've got a question for you, Vicky. Somebody is asking if you're able to share what trends and data you're looking at as part of continuous monitoring to detect conflicts of interest risks. So I think I know some of the answer to this, but I would love to hear your answer too.
Yeah, so it's the data we're looking at. We have all kinds of transaction data, revenue data, employee reimbursement data. Really, we pulled in, and Verity, you can probably speak to, I am not an expert in these different data systems. I've done my best to learn them.
I mean, you don't know all 80 analyses off by heart.
Yeah, no. No. But so the conflict of interest is really one part of what we're looking at. The system we've built looks at a whole host of different risks, different criteria. If we know, like through the conflict of interest disclosure piece, that there's a potential conflict of interest, we would maybe put a flag for that, individual, or that, if it's like, say, a third party that there's a conflict of interest with, and we feel that we can, control for the risk, but you may just want to have eyes on that to more closely monitor those transactions in a given period of time. So I really think it's, that's what I like about the tool, is that it's not set in stone. We can always add more criteria to what we want to be, elevated to us for review. So it just really, it's very, fact specific, I think, what we're trying to analyze for conflict of interest. In general, there's just so many ways that a conflict of interest can manifest itself. So, I think you just want to have eyes on any interaction between parties that may just present, and then try to understand
potential risk areas. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I can get slightly more specific on one of the ways in which we're able to do that too. Yeah. So, what we see as quite low-hanging fruit from a data perspective is, doing a conflicts of interest check between your vendors and your employees. So, one of the automated checks that's happening is, matching your HR data with your vendor master data, so that if there are any matches on invoices that you receive or bank details that you are paying, name, address, telephone number, banking information, the extent to which we go that far depends on the country as well, as you would probably imagine. But that's a very quick and easy automated check that can be implemented as part of a data analytics tool. So and then you can also do the same thing, your customers match with vendors, so just sort of attribute matching of different data sets in an automated way. I've got another question here. What is the best practice to deal with defaulters who are not in compliance with gifts and entertainment policy, identified through monitoring activities? Sometimes these are fairly senior people in an organization. Would you suggest reaching out via email, refresher training? I think we've touched on some of this already, but Jess, have you got anything else to sort of add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of start with doing the fact finding. We kind of follow the expense and any information we can glean about, who might have approved it. Sometimes that's just outreach to the supervisor or to a finance person, whatever pieces of data we need to just sort of, understand that expense and whether it was appropriate and authorized. We'll kind of gather all those facts. And then, if you conclude that, someone really didn't follow the policy, then I think, again, it's always sort of a judgment about what's the appropriate discipline. And I appreciated sort of Vicki was saying, you want some consistency, you want some framework around that, just some way that you think about, progression of, different kinds of incidents you generally want to sort of handle similarly. But I think there's always, just a kind of case by case analysis. I think we usually will bring the right business stakeholders in. So, sometimes that person's manager, should understand what happened, and maybe there's education for the manager as well. Sometimes, depending on what happened and the seniority and how significant it is, you're going higher and broader, than the manager, to make sure that whatever the sort of root cause of that issue is, you're really sort of getting at that in how you address it. So I think a lot of situations, are minor and low level, and we're really sort of working with the employee and working with whoever the sort of expense reviewers are to just do a little education. And I think that's in many, many cases going to sort of solve your issue from happening again. But if you have more serious issues and bigger issues and people who perhaps should have known and acted in a way that they shouldn't have, then you're bringing in other partners, senior people, HR, others that really can help come up with, what's the right outcome, given the conduct.
Right. The detection piece is just step one, right? You have to investigate and figure out the why and figure out how, root cause and what you can do to make this, better going forward. But I mean, I do think there's value in consistency, but you do have to, I agree with you, Jessica, you have to look at each case and kind of understand why this violation of policy occurred.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a couple more questions here, and I've got one eye on the clock. So somebody has asked, who would recommend the disciplinary steps to come from? Is it ethics and compliance or other teams such as policy owners and or HR that should follow up on a questionable expense, or is it E&C's role to highlight issues and risks to business leaders, or also reinforce corrective behavior with specific employees? What are your thoughts around that, please?
Do you want to go, Jessica, or do you want me to answer that?
Go ahead, Vicki.
I was just say, so we work, ethics and compliance would investigate, we would be the primary people to investigate an issue that arose like that. But we work very closely with our HR team. So before I would take any sort of disciplinary action at all, we would work in very close connection with our HR teams.
Right.
Yeah, that's very similar for us. I mean, I think we would help, do the fact finding. We might formulate a recommendation, and then we're sort of partnering with HR and employment law, and sometimes finance is involved to really all put our heads together on, what's the right outcome, who's best to sort of message it in the circumstances. But I think it's definitely a partnership.
Perfect. And then I've got a question here. It's quite specific, but I want to make sure we get to all of these. So if an employee wins a raffle at an event, would that be considered a gift? What if a vendor organizes the event exclusively for a particular company? Would a raffle prize won by an employee of that company at such an event still be considered a raffle and not a gift? So I think this really sort of feeds into the nuances, and perhaps different companies would have different answers here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
That's one of those things where having insights and just seeing more of these patterns, right? You're like, oh, I didn't think about that, right? Like when I wrote the policy, I was thinking of A, B, and C scenarios. So these new scenarios come up. So it comes up, not infrequently, where you have a scenario that you didn't really, plan for. So I mean, I really think it's a company specific decision how you want to treat those things. But I do think it's, to think those through ahead of time, or as they arise, then have like a policy, so it's clear to all employees how you're going to treat those scenarios.
Yeah, I think it's like one of those things that, exactly to that point, that you can't enumerate every single scenario, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to try to do that, to really put so much specificity in, for all these use cases, and there's just a danger that then the one that doesn't fit in your enumerated scenarios kind of gets missed. And so I think we sort of go the direction of having a bit of a general rule and some general concepts and principles, giving some illustrative examples. So like, these are the kinds of things we really mean, and we know that these come up a lot. But then, sometimes there is a judgment. The employees have to look at the principles and sort of say, all right, my situation kind of seems like it fits. And I think something like a raffle would be a good example, where I think some employees would probably raise it and say, hey, I'm this is something that's being offered to me. Here's the circumstances. I think in the circumstances, I would imagine we would probably be comfortable with it, but think that it's perfectly appropriate to, raise their hands and say, like, I've evaluated all these principles in the policy, and it seems like it, meets all of them in terms of being, reasonable and not intended to influence me inappropriately, and, all of those things. But it is a good example where, like, I don't know that we like call it out specifically, but it probably falls into like our definition broadly. So people, I think, could raise it to us.
Right, and that's just to add to what Jessica was saying. I think that you look at as your program as a whole, right? Like you encourage employees. I think it's very important to have your employees feel comfortable coming to you in the ethics compliance department with questions. I always say I would rather have you over disclose, and we'll work it out. So in that scenario, I think that I probably would maybe not change the policy, but I would maybe incorporate some of the specific examples we've seen in our trainings, right? To the decisions we've made in those one-off situations. But again, the key is, I always want people to come to me. I'd rather have, be able to say, oh, this is not an issue. You didn't have to disclose this than the other way.
Great. There are some more questions that are flying through at the end, and I'm afraid we won't have time to get to them. But I did just want to pose a final question to both of you. Beyond what we have already discussed, do you have any other best practices or practical takeaways from your experiences that you wanted to share with everyone today? And we will follow up with any questions that we haven't answered, we haven't had time to get to on the webinar today. Vicky, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything really in addition. I mean, just what I would, just closing thoughts on some of the things that we touched on. I think having business buy-in in these situations, being willing to, you encourage feedback, but also being willing to incorporate the feedback that you receive, and trying to make these all with a goal of making really encouraging compliance and making it as easy as possible for employees to comply. And then on the flip side is having a system to monitor non-compliance or patterns that is important for us to see.
Thanks, Vicky. Jess?
The only other thing I was thinking about is, if people are sort of on a journey to kind of enhance their programs and move toward more, analytics and systematic, to sort of not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of thinking about just accessible steps along the way. Like, even if you can't access all the data, it's not centralized, you can only do a piece of it, really just thinking about what are those bits of risk attributes that maybe I can put together, and it's not going to give me a complete picture, but it's something to just keep sort of building upon. So I think just feeling good about those, that evolution, even if it's a longer journey to get to really consolidated data and all the sort of ideal state that we're sort of talking about.
I love that.
That's a great point.
Great point, absolutely. I think that's probably people's first concern when it comes to using data, is that it's never good enough, it's never ready. But I want to thank everyone so much for your attendance today. Thank you so much, Jess and Vicky, for your expertise. We hope to see you on the next webinar, which will be in the new year. But in the meantime, wishing you all happy holidays, and thank you so much for making the time to attend this session today. Bye.
Thank you.